Welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If this is your first time listening in, welcome. We're happy to have you join us. The purpose of this podcast is to provide some valuable content for people who are on a journey involving Lean, Six Sigma, theory of constraints, all things continuous improvement. Our mission is simple: to improve companies and improve careers through continuous improvement. So we're here to share inspiring stories and journeys from individuals who have embarked on this path of continuous improvement. Through these interviews with leaders and innovators and change makers, we explore the sparks that ignite transformative journeys, both within organizations and in personal and career growth. So whether you're just starting out or looking to take your improvement efforts to the next level, this podcast is here to help guide, inspire, and empower you. I am your host, Keith Norris, and our guest today is Dr. Alan Barnard. Dr. Alan is one of the leading decision scientists and theory of constraint experts in the world. As the CEO of Goldratt Research Labs, he worked directly with Dr. Eli Goldratt, the one and only best-selling author, scientist, business leader, and creator of the theory of constraints and the book, The Goal, which I have a long relationship with, going back over 20 years. So looking forward to chatting about that. So Dr. Allen, welcome. Happy to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation.
So I think you have a very, very interesting story. I've been super excited to have a little chat with you. Having worked with Dr. Goldratt, maybe tell us about that a little bit. I'm curious to know how you got your start into this world of continuous improvement that has so many areas. But tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, I grew up in South Africa, and I was just always very curious about why some people succeed in life in any aspect that they're passionate about, and why others don't. I had a grandfather that was a very deep thinker, and he gave me this book called Marquis Who's Who, and he asked me to read it, and it was basically a thick encyclopedia type of book with biographies of the most successful people in every field. And my first observation was when you study these people's biographies, you find out that most of them didn't have ideal starting conditions. In fact, just the opposite. They came from poverty, their parents weren't educated, sometimes they even suffered neglect or abuse, often had learning disabilities. All the odds were against them, and yet they succeeded. To me, was intriguing to say, what was it? And my conclusion was it's not really your starting conditions that matter so much, is your starting assumptions or beliefs. And I thought, okay, Henry Ford's famous quote of whether you believe you can do something or can't, you're right. And that got me into this field of thinking about, not just continuously improving myself, but finding some way of making a unique contribution. I went and studied engineering, and during that I read The Goal, and there was something in the foreword of The Goal that already captured my attention, which to me was Dr. Goldratt's simplest possible way of defining the scientific method. He said, to make a breakthrough in any field that you're passionate about requires only 2 steps. Step 1 is have the courage to face inconsistencies between how you expect things to be, how things could be, and how they are. And the second step is be willing to challenge basic assumptions. And there's only 2 basic assumptions: the assumptions on which we build our expectations, and the assumptions on which we take actions. And I thought that was the field I wanted to go into. I was very lucky soon after graduating to be able to start implementing theory of constraints in our company. And then soon after that, was very, very honored to have met Dr. Goldratt. And we very quickly, had some kind of click. And I said to him, my goal is to help people make better, faster decisions by identifying what assumptions or beliefs they have. Not that's right or wrong, but whether it's helpful or harmful, right? Helpful means these assumptions or beliefs help us to move closer to the goal. Harmful means it takes further away. And that's sort of how my journey started.
That's so interesting. So you mentioned a couple of things there that resonate, or I have some, some terminology. So the first one was, I might call it the gap. So the recognition of the space between where you are and where you want to be. Let me ask you this. For anybody that's not familiar with The Goal or Dr. Goldratt, how would you describe what theory of constraints is?
Well, if you build on that, say you have a goal or there's a potential that exists, and your reality is way below that, right? That could be an impact goal for yourself, of the impact that you want to make in the world, or an income, or both, right? Now, that gap will create stress, right? And we have to cope with it. And there's only a couple of ways of coping with it. One is that you find something or someone to blame, which definitely provides relief, but it's not that useful. The
We're not
other
going to
one
talk
is,
about politics, are we?
yeah, the other one is you can blame yourself, right? That's probably even worse, right? Again, not that useful. The reality is, if that gap remains, you are going to experience stress and anxiety. And essentially, what theory of constraints proposes is that when you're thinking about trying to improve any system, whether it's a person, a company, even a country, every system will have a constraint. There's always going to be one weakest link. And it doesn't matter whether you have 3 links in the chain, very simple system, or there's 3,000 links, very complex system, right? There's always one weakest link. And a different approach to closing that gap is to ask yourself, where's the constraint? And theory of constraints provide a very simple, but I think highly practical definition of a constraint. In order to achieve a goal, you need to do some work. You have to provide a product or service. In order to do the work, you need resources. And there's basically 5 types of resources you need to achieve a goal. You need enough demand. If my goal is to feed 1 million people or make $1 million, I need to make sure that there's enough demand for whatever the product or service I provide. You need enough capacity of the internal resources that you own. You need enough supply, which is external resources. You need enough cash, and you need enough attention, right? What theory of constraints says is, if you look at that gap at any point in time, there's at least one of those that you don't have enough of. And to continuously improve, which is, by the way, the subtitle of the goal, kind of most people, I think, miss that. The goal is not to make money or to make an impact. The goal is really a process of ongoing improvement, right? Find some way of constantly improving. And in order to constantly improve, you have to find out, where's the constraint currently? How can I make sure I don't waste what I have? And if it's still not enough, then how do I get more? And I just keep on circling through those 5 focusing steps.
Yeah, what are those 5 focusing steps in that theory of constraint?
So it starts with a sort of a step 0, which is implicit. It says, do you have a goal? If you don't have a goal, my advice is that's the one thing to focus on, right? Because it changes everything. It will tell you what work you have to do, what resources you need, also what rules you have to use to better manage the system so you don't local optimize, and what measurements you need. So that's step 0 is identify the goal, how you're going to measure it. Step 1 is identify the system constraints. And that's something that most people kind of ignore, is when Goldratt wrote it, he put S in brackets, identify the system constraints, right? Even though there's theoretically only one weakest link, it could be at any point in time that there's multiple resources that I don't have enough of, which kind of creates chaos, right? I don't have enough demand or capacity or supply or cash or management attention. Okay, in those cases, kind of lower your goal until one is the clear constraint, right? Step 2 says decide how to better exploit and not waste this. So that means if you have a market constraint, what percentage of the market do you have? I have 5%. Okay. There's 95% of my dream customers not buying from me, right? How do I not waste them? What is the irresistible offer I can make them, right? If I have a capacity constraint, how frequently does it happen that my capacity constraint is standing idle because it's starved or blocked or working on something it shouldn't, right? How do I not waste it? Step 2 is that I decide how to better exploit and not waste the constraint. Step 3 is the most important step. It says subordinate everything to that decision. Go and change any policy, measurement, or rule that is in conflict with that decision. And that is very interesting. So if you think about, if you have an internal constraint, right, you could sell whatever you produce. You might come up with a rule that says, I want to run as long batches as possible. Because every time I stop to switch from one product to another, I have a setup, and that means lost production. And ideally, you should then only produce one product. If you could sell everything of that one product, then just do one product. Like Henry Ford said, you can have it any color as long as it's black.
It's not his black.
Why? Because it's not that he had a big ego or specifically something to do with black. It was because he knew his bottleneck was the paint shop, and black dried the quickest. And that was his best way of not wasting that bottleneck capacity, right? But what subordinate says is that, what if the constraint is now in a different place and you still have this policy that says run very long batches, right? And you're now producing 1,000 when the market only wants 200. You've just lost 80% of your bottleneck capacity producing stuff that's not needed or not now. You take a software company, right? Take something like Excel. What percentage of the functionality in Excel do you think most super users use?
3%?
Probably 20%, right? So it's 80% overproduction. So subordinate says, find out any policy or measurement or rule that's incentivizing people to waste the constraint and change only that. That's a really important step, step 3. Step 4 says, if after the subordination, you would have raised the level of your constraint, right? You would have found more market, more capacity, more supply, more cash, more management attention. Check, is it enough to achieve the goal? If it's not, then step 4 says, now elevate the constraint. Now go and get more, right? If it's a market constraint, now go and add more products or go into new markets. But first, try to exploit first what you have, current products to current market. If you're already exploiting to the best your machine capacity or bottleneck capacity, now go and buy another machine or hire another salesperson. And then the last step is, do not allow inertia to cause a constraint. And that's a big thing because, as you know, in your introduction, status quo bias is massively strong, right? And there's a good reason for it, because 70% of all changes fail. So if you have a status quo bias, it's a very safe bias to have, because in 70% of the cases, you'll be right to resist any change.
Yeah.
But Goldratt warns against that and says, be careful. There's going to be that 30% where you're going to be wrong, and that will then cause a constraint. So step 5 says, if you've broken a constraint in one of the previous steps, do not allow inertia to cause a constraint. Go back to step 1. And sometimes you even go back to step 0, which says, maybe my goal has changed. So those are the 5 focusing steps of theory of constraint.
I love that. I love that. You said some things earlier that I'm super pleased to hear. One of them is that you've had this interest in this type of work since, at an early age. This is one thing that I love about this work and this space and just the people that I interact with is, like you could describe this as a core value or something at a personal or a professional level. The term growth mindset is frequently used to describe that not everybody necessarily is drawn to that, but I can see that you're obviously one of those kind of people, and that's probably part of what got you into this particular work. So I find that really interesting. The other thing about this work that I find interesting is how many layers it is, because the theory of constraints is one of those things that sounds so simple, right? Like focus on the bottleneck, focus on the thing, it just sounds so simple. But yet there's probably millions of different ways that this can show up. So when you mention identify the goal, I'm assuming that there's a limited number of goals that a system might have. Is that right? I think you mentioned that. Maybe you could touch on the types of goals that somebody might be looking for in their system.
And I think that's a great kind of introduction. If I was talking to somebody about theory of constraints, the question is, what problem does it solve, right? And the most basic problem is, if you're trying to constantly or continuously improve any system, whether it's you as a person, people that you care about, your company, even your country, right? There's always many, many things that I can improve, many things that I can change. How do I differentiate between that, which is the noise, right? These very appealing little, distractions
Yeah.
to finding the one thing that I must change now. So every step that I've just described, it's a battle to go from many to not just few, but to one. So if you take projects as an example, right? And you go, what is the goal of a project? And if you ask that question to a group of people, you'll probably get a list of maybe 20, 30 things. That's many, right? Then you can try to get them down to a few. And I go, well, we have to deliver the project on time, in scope, on budget. Say, okay, that's few. Now we have 3, but that's still too many. What's the one goal, right? And essentially what Goldratt had realized is if you have multiple objectives, even if it's a few, you still need one as the primary one. And the way to choose is to pick one that if you improve that, the others will also improve. And in a project environment, he found that to be his flow time. If you can reduce the time it takes to do a project, which essentially means, that constraint is a flow time constraint. Deciding how to exploit and not waste that constraint is identifying all the avoidable delays, right? Subordinate means change any policy process that's causing these avoidable delays, right? By reducing the flow time, I'm going to deliver more projects on time. I'll be able to do it with more scope and well below budget. But you have to go to one goal. Then the next challenge is, I have one goal, what's the one constraint? And then people say, oh, we have many constraints. Okay, how do we go from many to few? And then how do we get to the one that if we got more of that, the amount of goal units will go up, right? And it's conceptually simple, like you say, but practically can be very difficult if you think about systems that are highly balanced. So we use digital twins to answer that question. Because what you can do with a digital twin is you identify the candidates that could be causing delays in the flow. And then you say, what if I add one more capacity unit or capability unit to that resource? Let me rerun the simulation and see if the goal units go up. Yes, it does. Fantastic. Let me add another unit. Goal units go up. Perfect. Let me add another unit. Goal units didn't go up. The constraint must have moved somewhere else, right?
Else.
So if you could do practical experimentation, you can use this kind of method, because sometimes you find that we don't have enough demand, we don't have enough capacity, we don't have enough supply, we don't have enough cash, we don't have enough management attention, complete chaos. Like, where do I focus? Pick the one that if you can improve that, the whole system will improve.
And I believe that building these models is part of what you do, for your work with your company, right? Building
Yeah.
some of these decision models. Okay, excellent.
Yeah, and it was a kind of necessity is a mother of invention, right?
Yeah.
I was very privileged when I co-founded Goldratt Research Labs that we immediately attracted attentions of some of the biggest companies in the world, right? So we worked with Cisco Systems, with Microsoft, with ABB, Tata Steel, etc. And when we were proposing some kind of solution that was based on theory of constraints, it's way too high risk for them to just try it. And even doing a pilot sometimes is not just high risk, but takes a long time. And it's actually really hard to control because there's so many things that are happening at the same time, right? So we started building simulation models or digital twins to test our hypothesis. Like, if you implemented the theory of constraint solution for manufacturing or distribution of projects, will you actually achieve more of your goal? Will you generate more profit, better ROI, more free cash flow? The problem was building these models took somewhere between 3 to 24 months. And we had to overcome that. Became our bottleneck, right? That was the thing that, yes, you could make money, but you can't scale because you need really, really experienced resources to build these models. we have found a way of building these models now directly from data that's sitting in their IT system like SAP, and we can do it within 3 to 24 seconds. So
That sounds
that's a
intriguing.
key part of every project that we do, is to validate any hypothesis about what's causing that gap or what is required to close the gap. We can now test it within digital twins.
So let's talk about this idea of a strategy for just a moment. This is one of the concepts that I find really interesting in this world of continuous improvement. And so I use this umbrella language of continuous improvement. And within that, there's lots of things like Lean and Six Sigma. And I would basically say any sort of business improvement methodology is a tool in that toolbox, perhaps. And I find that there's always these paradoxes or these extremes where people in this field tend to push and pull, like lean is the tool to use for everything. And there's probably ways to use theory of constraint properly and ways to use theory of constraints not so properly. Is there some examples of like the best way to use theory of constraints, or people inside of an organization that should really know this versus, areas where it's maybe less important?
Yeah, so I think one of the good references that your viewers or readers or listeners can go through is an article that Goldratt wrote called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And he basically co-authored it with Toyota. And what he shares in the article is, if you look at the solution that Henry Ford developed for flow lines, right? And the solution that Toyota developed for manufacturing systems that produce more than one product, right?
Yeah.
And what Goldratt developed for very large variety items, the drum buffer rope mechanism of TOC, these are all different applications, but they were guided by exactly the same principles, universal principles, which says, number one, your primary objective in operation should be to reduce flow time. Because if you can reduce flow time, you can increase throughput, you can improve quality, you can reduce cost, etc. Second one is stop overproducing, right? You need a mechanism to avoid overproduction. Henry Ford used space between two machines. Later, it became a conveyor belt. The space is full, the person stops because there's no place to put the stuff down, right? Daiichi came along and said, well, what if you do more than one product? You can't just use space. You have to tell people what should be in that space. So he created Kanbans. Okay, you have 4 products, right? How big should the Kanban be for product 1, 2, 3, 4? If the Kanban is full, stop. If it's empty, replenish it. So again, it was a practical mechanism to stop overproduction. Goldratt came along and said, what if you have such a variety like you're in a job shop, where filling up Kanbans when you don't know when or even if it will be needed will be causing the problem that you're trying to solve, which is overproduction. And he said the only way to do that is through time. Control the release of work into the system with a time buffer. So you had space buffer, stock buffer, time buffer. Same principle, very different application. And there's not one that's better than the other. It's more, what's your conditions? You produce one product, then go for the flow line. You produce limited variety, go for lean, Toyota production system. You produce very large variety, you have to use TOC as an application.
I love that you've got such clarity on the scenarios to use each one of these, because I think these are the kind of decisions that, a lot of people, myself included, like you can get in this like hamster wheel of getting stuck. Like, I know that there's a use for this thing. Let me ask you this. How would you go about identifying the constraint in a system? Are there some things to look for in your system that might give you clues that, oh, this could be your constraint?
Yeah, so bottlenecks create backlogs, right? So that would be your first practical step. Most of the time, unfortunately, the data is inaccurate, because that would have been an alternative, right? I can backward calculate from my goal to say, I want to make $1 million or feed 1 million people, right? And I can go backwards from that, and I can calculate the demand that will place on every part of my system, including finance, HR, legal, etc. And then I can simply do a match. Okay, I need 10 resources to meet the goal. I have 5. I have a bottleneck. Okay. So if the data was accurate, then absolutely you should solve the problem by doing the calculations. problem is most of the time the data is not there. So what do I do now is I look for backlogs. What is the flow waiting for? And what is the longest waiting period in that flow? And that is essentially my bottleneck. So the bottleneck is the thing that causes the biggest delay in the flow. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. And I work in the software industry, software, building software products is kind of my everyday work. And I love this whole, I refer to it as lean or continuous improvement or business improvement. And so often there's these manufacturing examples. Everybody talks about Toyota and you talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. I find it really interesting that, your examples from Henry Ford to Toyota to Agile and, now the whole Agile software development method is like this new thing. And it's really just somebody else standing on the shoulders of somebody else, iterating on things like small batches.
Yeah.
One thing I find really interesting is how many of these lessons that can be learned, like let's say we're having a conversation about manufacturing and inventory piling up on a warehouse, but maybe there's somebody who does knowledge work or digital work or service work. What do some of those things look like in a knowledge work environment?
Yeah. So I think it's the same thing as like if I was looking around, so imagine I walk into an office and people had an inbox and the amount of tasks that waiting for them was visible in that inbox, right? I just look for the one that has the biggest inbox.
The biggest inbox.
Yeah, that's the constraint internal, right? But I think that what's important is to take a step back. The Lord of the Rings says there's the ring that rules them all, right? And I think it's true for constraints. I mentioned that if you're clear on your goal, you can only have one of 5 constraints. You don't have enough demand to achieve the goal, or capacity, supply, cash, or management attention. The constraint that rules them all is demand, right? If there's not enough demand for your product or service, whether you're private or public sector, whether you're small or big, whether you're a software company or steel manufacturer, that's the biggest problem to solve. If you can solve that one, right, the others become conceptually much simpler. Tony Robbins uses a really nice framework that I like, that he learned from Tony Hsieh, the guy that started Zappos. He said there's really only 3 questions for any business, private or public sector. Who is your dream customer, right? Who will benefit most from the product or service that you provide? And then the next question is, what's your irresistible offer to them? And a practical way of answering that is, what can you do or are willing to do that no significant competitor? And then the last part is, how do you over-deliver? So you turn a client into a raving fan, right? And that to me is almost always where we start, is to say, if you can just target your dream customer, don't try to sell to everybody because then nobody will buy. Try to sell to only those that you can add most value to. Think about an irresistible offer. That's a great starting point, because then you can say, okay, now do I have enough capacity to serve these dream customers on the irresistible offer, right? It's a way to escape that cycle where you don't have enough of everything. It's like refocus, one goal, my dream customer, irresistible offer. How can I over-deliver? How do I have enough capacity, cash, and management attention to do that?
One thing that I find interesting on this topic is this idea of whose job is it to improve or to make the improvements. And on one hand, let's say that you've got an organization who says everybody's job is, everybody needs to have goals, everybody needs to get better. It's everybody's job to just improve everywhere, which I see a lot of, actually. But I feel like you might have a different opinion on how to focus your improvement efforts.
Yeah, so if you think about a system and the subsystems, right, or the parts of the system is where you set the goal, right? This is the impact that we want to make. This is the income that we want to generate, right? And it's a continuous improvement. It's not a destination. It's a series of destinations as I'm growing, right? I want more and more and more and more of that thing. Now the question is, what's the goal of the subsystems, the parts? And for me, it's really simple, which is make sure you have enough resources to meet the demand that the system is placing on you. That's your goal. So you can apply theory of constraints to any system, but also every part of the system. The only difference is the goal. The goal of the part is not to optimize the part. The goal of the part is to make sure it has enough resources to meet the demand that the system is placing on it in order to achieve its goal. But then the rest of the thing still applies. Where's the constraint in my department? What don't I have enough of? So I want to feed 1 million people. Okay, that translates into me having to prepare 1 million cups of soup every day. Okay, where am I going to serve them? How many places? I can calculate backwards to say, these are the resources I need to freely meet the demand that's placed on what don't I have enough of. Okay. The next question is, before you go and ask for more, are you properly using it, or are you wasting it doing stuff that you shouldn't be doing? Right? Subordinate, change any policy that's against that. If it's still not enough, now go and ask for more. Now go and elevate. And then go back to step one.
If the people listening to this podcast are going to be in different roles inside of organizations. Some of them may be executives, some of them might be in like a finance type role or operations, or in a CI function or in a quality function. If I was like a CFO inside of a company, what are some maybe things to look for or things to be careful of before spending a whole bunch of money, maybe opening up a new plant or approving new headcount? How might we use theory of constraints in avoiding spending unnecessary money?
Great question. So if I was the CFO, the first thing that I would be looking at is, what's my total cash to cash cycle, right? That's my job, is to shrink that, right? And what's causing the biggest delay in that cash to cash cycle? And you often find something that's causing the biggest delay that really shouldn't be. I was recently working for a mining department, right? There's more demand for the product than what they can produce, right? Their constraint was their legal department, taking months to write legal supply agreements, right? So when we looked at their cash-to-cash cycle, that was the thing that was by far taking up most time. It was driving the sales guys crazy. And when you go to the legal department, like, why? Well, we have a budget. We can't afford to appoint more people. It's like, okay, but you're constraining the growth of the whole company, right? It's like every day that we lose is about $1 million. Right? I think it's that mindset of thinking about what's the goal and how much time is it taking me to achieve that goal, and how can I find out what's causing the biggest delays. Sometimes it's not having enough of a resource. Sometimes there's delays in making a decision, getting a decision out, but looking for those big delays and then finding ways to compress that time.
Is there a way that you recommend maybe visually to identify that path? I mean, it sounds a little bit like we're talking about some process flow mapping, or
just literally a simple Gantt that says this whole cash to cash cycle at the moment is 120 days. Okay, let me see what makes up that thing, right? And it's normally work, wait.
Yeah.
And the wait is normally much longer than the work parts, right? So just finding out, what are we waiting for?
It sounds like you've got some really interesting experiences in this industry. I'd love to have you share some examples where you came across one of these, like maybe silly issues that was able to free up and create an impact. Is there a few examples?
I mean, we've done work, for example, with Utah state government, right? It's like implementing theory of constraints in each of their state agencies, right? 24 state agencies. And then you say, okay, what's your goal, right? And again, because it's an agency, their goal is to meet the demand that's placed on them, right? That's their goal. Okay, are you clear about the demand? And then what don't you have enough of? And then you find out very silly reasons sometimes. Why are they not meeting that demand? And it's often because of rules that were put in place in the past that made perfect sense, and now suddenly don't make sense at all, right? So we've done work in government agencies with the World UN Food Program, right? It's like a simple little thing there in the Utah that we found, spend it or lose it policy, right? Our simulation showed between 5 and 8% of the total budget every year is wasted because of spend it or lose it. And it's because of the simple thing that says you have to predict a year ahead what the demand will be and how much resources you need. Now, that rule, where do you think it comes from? The fact that we do annual budgeting. It was in the old days when we did budgeting manually, right? It took a couple of months to get all the data. So we said, okay, the rule is let's not do this multiple times a year. Let's just do it once. But today we have IT systems that we can pull all the data almost every day. And we still do budgeting once a year, right? So it makes us much less responsive, first of all, to changes in demand or capacity. But it also, because of the spend it or lose it rule, somebody was frugal the whole year. They had 100 million budget. They only needed 80 million. And now they realize unless they spend it, they lose it, not just this year or next year. So I came up with a very simple solution to that, which I call save it and share it. So if you have 10 million remaining, you can keep half of it and you can apply it to any line item in your budget.
Interesting.
And the other half you return back to the treasury. That will help those other agencies where maybe the demand was more than expected and they didn't have enough budget.
And you call that save it and share it?
Yeah, save it and share it rather than spend it or lose it.
I like it. That's a good one. So just let's come back to that. Just explain the concept of save it and share it.
Yeah, so if you think about it, you're trying to predict what the demand is for the whole year, right? And now you put a budget together to have enough resources to meet that demand, right? Now the demand will be more or less than what you expected. If it's more, you have a problem because your budget won't be enough. And now you ask for more, right? But if the demand was less than you expected, or maybe you were more frugal or more efficient than what you expected, you now need less. But now you have this conflict. Do I spend it or lose it? If I spend it, it basically means that theoretically I could never be on or below budget because I don't benefit from any of the under expenditure, but I get nailed by the over expenditure. So even if just one agency overspends, but none of the others ever declare they're under, I will always be over budget. So the question is, how can I stop that from happening? How can I encourage people to be honest and not be penalized for it? So I say, okay, if you've been frugal or you were just lucky that the demand on your work services agency was less than expected, you left with 20 million. The problem with traditional budgeting is you have to spend the budget on the line item. So now we say simple change in the rule. If you've saved 20 million, keep half of it. Spend it on any line item where it ended up that you didn't have enough or that you can do much more to achieve more of the goal. And the other half, return it back to the treasury so they can allocate it very quickly to those departments that didn't have enough.
Really like that concept. It sounds to me like it requires a high trust environment. Is there some things that you can see leaders implementing that sort of a policy in their organization? What might that actually look like?
Yeah, I think the one is responsiveness, right? So if you do need more, then the system has to be quite responsive to be able to give you more. And that would be the thing to fix then why does it take so long to find out that we need more and to get authorization? But it also can help to think about how I should do capital versus OPEX, CapEx versus OPEX. If I am looking at the demand for specific service, say I'm a mining company, and I'm not sure what the demand will be, I say worst case, I'm going to need 5 trucks to meet the bare minimum demand on my mine. Best case, I might need 10 trucks. If the demand is really high, maybe the commodity price, started increasing, we got more demand, etc. Now the question is, how many trucks am I going to buy? It would be safe to buy 5. It wouldn't make sense to buy 10 because I might be stuck with 5 too many. So buy the 5 and rent the other 5 would be a good policy. The same with employing people, right? Like, what is the minimum that I need? I can safely go and hire those, but use contractors to fill up the difference. What the traditional thing is we kind of compromise. We say it won't be 5, it won't be 10, it might be 8, and then I go and hire 8. And I'm still stuck with too few or too many, rather than thinking about the range of the demand that will be placed on my part and how best to meet that demand.
I've seen you, I think I recall a post from you talking about how to set targets and how to deal with budgets and to use ranges instead of exact numbers. I had a mentor one time who I shared some projections, some financial projections, and he looked at them and he said, "Well, that's the one thing we know isn't going to happen. It's going to be higher, it's going to be lower. It's not going to be exactly that." So, to explain that concept of ranges a little bit, I think there's probably some benefit.
There's a great concept. I don't know if you've read the book Anti-Fragile.
I've heard of it recently.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. Nassim Taleb wrote it, but what he did was he said, if you think about classifying any system, a very useful way of classifying a system is based on how it responds to stresses. So imagine a system that is harmed more by negative stress than what it benefits from a positive stress. Even if it randomly gets positive and negative stresses, like a negative stress would be we ended up selling less than what we expected, a positive, we selling more than expected. Even if you got random positive and negative, if you get hurt more by a negative than what you benefit from a positive, the system will go down over time. A robust one is a system that has put mechanisms in place that limits the pain of a negative stress, but it also often limits the gain of a positive stress. It's like taking Prozac, it takes both sides off my emotions, the big negative and a big positive. What Taleb proposes is creating an anti-fragile system, one that can limit the pain of a negative stress, but can benefit fully from the positive stress. So if you think about a small business, right? Small business is fragile because if we sold 10% more, I'll make much more money. 20% I'll make more money. 30% more, suddenly I hit a capacity constraint. Can't deal with more than 30% increased demand. But if we lose 30% of our sales overnight, we can go bankrupt, right? So I get hurt more by a negative 30 than what I benefit from a plus 30. So that system is fragile. So the question is, how can I change that system so it can limit the pain from a negative event versus fully capitalize on a positive? Uber is a great example of that. It doesn't own the assets and it doesn't employ the drivers. So it can actually tolerate quite big drops in demand without going bankrupt. When there is a big spike in demand, it uses surge pricing to control flow. And that has two mechanisms. First of all, it allows them to fully capitalize on the increased margins, right? But the second thing is it adds additional capacity, because a person waiting on the couch, lying on the couch, thinking, I don't feel like driving today, suddenly gets a notification. Rather than making $200 a day, you can make $400. So it adds more capacity. Going back to the idea of ranges, picking a number, first of all, you don't know where in a distribution it fits. And all that you know is that it's just one of many possibilities. I like to think in ranges that says, what if we do 10, 20, 30, 40% worse than expected? How will our system respond to that? And if that can happen, how can we mitigate against that? Then look at the positive side. How will we respond if we get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% more? How can we capitalize on that to fully capitalize on that gain? And that's a direct benefit of not thinking in terms of numbers, but understanding there's a distribution, and you don't want to be hurt by the negative, and you want to be able to fully capitalize on the positive. By the way, this also explains people's personalities. You have some people that are harmed more by a bad day than what they benefit from a good day. And over time, they will become suicidal. It's unavoidable. And you have other people, like people that you mentioned with a growth mindset. They have figured out mechanisms to protect them from the downside pain. It's not that they don't get hurt or don't get sad, but they don't get stuck there for a long time. But if there's a positive, they figured out ways of fully capitalizing on that positive. Like AI is a good example, right? It's like every business is going to be disrupted by AI. Potentially, if you're a knowledge weight business, AI will overcome any capacity, capability, or capital constraint that you had before. And then the only constraint that's remaining is market, right?
It.
You'll have to refocus. Who's our dream customer? What's our irresistible offer? How can we over deliver to them?
That's interesting. You touched on something just a minute ago that is one of my interest in this space too, and I find these interesting parallels between the personal and the professional. So you're talking about theory of constraints, and I talk about improvement quite a bit, and I'm a big fan of like the Stephen Covey and the whole person type idea that success in one area of life isn't going to get you there if you have a failure in another. So you might think of that as a failure of a constraint in another area. And I find that a lot of this work inside organizations is kind of similar. Balancing flow is a good example. Having just one function of your business isn't good enough. You got to have each of them. I'm curious how you might use some of these concepts of theory of constraint in like your personal life.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of dimensions that you can apply it. One of it, you just mentioned flow, right? So there's two dimensions of flow. There's flow rate, like how much can I do? And there's flow time. How long does it take me to do it, right? We get into a state of flow when we are no longer aware of our senses, right? You are hyper productive and hyper creative in that flow state of mind. So the first challenge that we have is, how do I get into that state and how do I stay there as long as possible? That's also true for business. The business is hyper productive and hyper profitable if it can get into a flow state where the materials, the ideas just flow. It doesn't stop and start, right? Most of the time is actual work time. It's not waiting time. So that's already like one parallel between that is we're trying to improve flow. The time that we spend in flow, how can we reduce the flow time, etc. Another thing is the idea of where's the bottleneck. And if you think about you as a person, what resource do you have to allocate that's scarce? And if you misallocate it, could be highly consequential. There's three types of resources. One is attention. You could give something or someone attention that you shouldn't have, and that will limit you from achieving your goal of whether it's impact or income. You can also not give somebody your attention that you should have, and that would also limit you. The second one is trust, right? It's also a scarce resource. How do I know that? Because we have to allocate it. If it was abundant, we wouldn't have to allocate it, right? And
Yeah.
there's a risk of misallocating it. I can trust people and things I shouldn't, and I cannot trust people and things I should. So how do I allocate that scarce resource critically determines how successful I'll be. And the last part is energy or motivation. So again, you can apply the 5 focusing steps on that to say, in this period of my life, what don't I have enough of? Is it energy? Is it trust? Is it attention, right? How do I make sure I don't waste it? How do I subordinate to that? How do I elevate it? AI is a fantastic way of elevating our attention, right?
Yeah.
I can now build a clone of myself.
Wait a minute. Am I talking to an AI clone?
Exactly. It could be, right? The only way that you're going to be able to tell in the future is that the clone will probably look a little bit creepy because it's so perfect. It's actually hard to make AI be like humans, where we stumble over our words, we have awkward delays, and we lose attention. They will do that, and it becomes more and more realistic, but that's almost the only way that you'll be able to tell. It's my clone will be me on my best day every second.
It's so interesting. I mean, AI brings up a whole additional line of questioning. We might have to have another conversation in the future, because I am curious, with the constraints, the type of constraints that you see organizations face, how much of that really varies a lot based on the organization size? Like I may be assuming that in a small organization, generating that demand is probably pretty common. Do you see that change depending on the type of organization or the size of the organization?
I think
Patterns?
unless you're a monopoly, right, it's a good starting assumption that you probably have a demand constraint. And
And
that
then
if you
if
could
you've got a
solve that, the other constraints will be easy conceptually, right? It's like I was recently very privileged to meet this guy, Ben Lamb. He runs a company called Colossus. They are basically bringing back extinct species like the woolly mammoth, the Tasmanian tiger, the
Jurassic
dodo
Park
bird,
stuff, huh?
Jurassic Park stuff, right? And he is a big fan of theory of constraints. And I said to him, how do you apply it in a way that you think most others don't? And he said, if you can create enough demand, right, that will allow your business to grow exponentially, right, then all the solutions of TOC is really just efficiency measurements or efficiency mechanisms. If you have confidence that you will grow, you can just keep on elevating the resources, right? Don't waste time trying too much with clever algorithms, try to squeeze an additional 3 or 5% out of something, right? Just get more, make sure you have enough. And that to me is very interesting, comparing that to something like steel industry, where the time it takes to build capacity is enormously long and very, very costly. In those cases, right, being able to more efficiently schedule the plant with theory of constraints principles or lean, etc., is absolutely valuable.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that to me, I think in general, most companies ultimately have a demand constraint that they have to solve. If they solve it, the other problems are conceptually easier to solve, unless you have super complex environments like massively complex project environments, manufacturing. That's where the profound knowledge of TOC and lean comes in. It's like, how do I manage this to get more out in less time with the best possible quality?
Is there a set of metrics that you might recommend? Or let's say if a company is really interested in leveraging TOC, are there certain metrics that you would expect them to be paying attention to?
I think, like I mentioned, it's all about improving flow, but flow has these two dimensions, right? Flow rate is does my throughput match the demand? How big is that gap? So I don't see many companies measuring that directly.
So explain that a little bit, just to drill down on that concept. So you're saying
So
like the
yeah,
rate
I
at
have a
which
legal department, right? And I can, based on the goal that we've set for this year, financial goal, and the typical number of clients that we have, and how many contracts are typically involved in closing a client or maintaining it, I can work backwards with an estimate of min, likely max, see how much the demand is likely going to be on my department this year, and check if I have enough. That's the gap. And the backlog is the indication I didn't have enough, right?
yeah.
Is when things are starting to wait. The second metric is flow time, is how long does it take me from the moment I get notified that there's a demand on my department until I've been able to fulfill that demand. How long is that total time? And then to see inside of that, how much is actual work time versus wait time. I'll give an example. When we worked with the Utah state government, if you're issuing a business license, right, that could take 4 months, right? How much work do you think is involved in actually creating a business license?
Probably less than an hour
Exactly, right? So you realize, wow, most of the stuff is waiting
wait time.
time. So what is it waiting for? And that's so, but you first need to know how big is that gap. So a flow rate gap is, here's the demand, here's how much I have, how big is that gap, and what makes up that gap. Flow time, how long is it currently taking me? What is my work time as a percentage of that? The rest is all waiting. Where am I causing avoidable delays?
How do you think about like capacity and measurements of capacity in that
Yeah, so flow
formula?
rate is a way of checking what's my capacity versus my demand, right? And like I said, if we don't have a good metrics, just measure backlog immediately. That will tell you. Another way of doing it is just a cumulative flow diagram. So imagine I'm a buyer and the range of work that I do varies dramatically. And I just simply, from tomorrow, I start measuring and plotting cumulatively the amount of purchase requisitions that's coming into my department. And then I'm cumulatively plotting the completion of purchase orders. If these two run in parallel, I know that I'm balancing demand and supply. But when they are like this, which means the arrival rate is faster than my completion rate, that vertical gap is the backlog that's building up. Right? And our horizontal gap is my time that will keep growing exponentially. So that's another simple way that any department can check if they're becoming a bottleneck is just take the transactions that's arriving and a transaction when they're completing and plotting them cumulatively. If they are like this, that tells you you have too many resources. You're running out of work. So either find a way to increase the work, letting people know we can take on more work, or you have to reduce your resources.
So it sounds like just plotting the arrival, the number of things that come in a day and a week, and the number that ship out in a day and a week, and keeping those somewhat in balance. What about when you've got a whole bunch in that work in process state? Is there a simple solution to reducing that?
Yeah, the simple solution is to think about utilization. If you ask yourself, say I said to you, Keith, how long will it take you to do a one-day task?
Well, let's say a one-day
It's really
task,
a one-day
but it'll
task.
take me 2 weeks to get to it or something.
Okay. Well, that's the right answer depends. What does it depends on? It depends on your utilization. If you had nothing else on the plate, it will take 1 day. If you were 50% utilized, it will take 2 days. 80% utilized, it will take 5 days. 90% utilized, it will take 10 days. If you're already 99% utilized, that 1 day task will take 100 days.
That's
Right.
interesting.
So that's my backlog. I now have a backlog of 99. So how can I get back down to the 10 or maybe even the 5 is I have to look at what is taking up your capacity so we can stop you from doing that, right? If there's nothing that you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, you're all doing real work, then how can I use AI to automate it?
Yeah.
And that will reduce your utilization, and that will have a disproportionate reduction in that time it takes you to complete work.
Is there any rules of thumb that you can share that are maybe applicable for different types of industries? I seem to recall something from an MBA class about utilization rates, like once they go beyond a certain number that
80% is a pretty good rule of thumb. Yeah.
you say 80?
80%. So
80%.
it's basically a practical guideline is never load any resource more than 80%. There are
Interesting.
cases where if there's very low variability, then you could push it up to 90. There are cases where there's extreme variability, where anything more than 40, 50% might be too much. Think about a gas station, right? If I asked you the most profitable gas stations, what utilization do you think they run their gas pumps at? Now, if it was 100%, it means that there has to be an infinite
Right.
queue of cars
Yeah.
waiting to be filled, right?
Yeah.
The actual number is around 20%.
20%.
Yeah, because more than that means that frequently there's more than 2 cars, and a typical driver, if they see already 2 cars waiting, they'll just drive past.
My mom told me I should get gas at Costco because I can save a few cents. And every time I drive past it, there's 4 or 5 cars in line.
Exactly.
I just can't bear to wait.
But to get back to your point, about 80%, and what I practically do, if we go into a complex environment, it's people doing the work or machines. I say, if you're running 5 days a week, just plan 4. Plan your commitments on 4 days production and use the 5th day as a buffer.
That's very good advice. That's very good advice.
And that will keep you out of that chaos zone where, not only your lead times grow exponentially from like 5 to 10 to 100 days and very quickly, but your reliability of making commitments drops exponentially, and also your throughput starts dropping. Because the more there's in backlog, the longer it takes you to figure out what to work on next. And the easier it is to make mistakes in prioritization, and the more common desynchronization is. So you want to stay out of that last 20% chaos zone. And the simplest way is just don't overcommit. Don't commit more than 80% of your capacity.
I'm super intrigued. This makes me think of a problem, I guess, a situation inside my own business that I'm thinking about with flow. We've got, we build software, so we have individual software changes that are, starting and then finishing. And every week we have a batch that's finished, and every week we have a batch that starts. And for the most part, things, on average, I say they get through in a week, but then there's some that stay for weeks and weeks and weeks. Is there something that you recommend for like measuring how long something spent inside the system as a
That is
measurement?
exactly the flow time. Like
Yeah.
what we said previously, if the work is very different, you're going to have to find some way of normalizing it. So with my team also doing software development, I say to him, classify everything as small, medium, large, or extra large. A medium is 3 times as much as a small in terms of effort. A large is maybe 5 times, an extra large is 10 times. So what that allows them to do is as soon as work arrive, they classify it, and that is what they are plotting, right? So everything is plotted based on number of smalls that we've got in the system. And then I can say, okay, now I'm plotting the arrival rates in the number of equivalent small tasks, and I'm plotting departures or completions also in small. So if I finish a large, I get 10 credits, 10 smalls that I finished, right?
Yeah.
But again, what I'm looking for is what's happening with the demand versus supply. If I stand back for a long enough time period, they should be balanced. I know I have enough resource. If they're converging, I know I have too much. If they are diverging, I have too few. So it's a very quick way, without even understanding what's happening inside that system, to check if you have too much or too little capacity.
Yeah, it seems like there's some interesting metrics in there that, let's say, a very large organization with multiple locations, multiple work streams, perhaps there's some good metrics in there to keep an eye on whether you've got enough or not enough or too many resources.
We implemented this metrics. One of the biggest fear of constraints projects I did was with Cisco Systems. And John Chambers at the time was the CEO. And he basically asked, I asked him, is there anything that you want us to work on? And he said, one of the biggest frustrations is when he asks people, okay, there's been a delay in the supply chain. How long will it take to fix? And I go, well, it's a 1-week delay, so it'll take us a week or so to fix it. And he said, it always takes much, much longer. Why is that? And what I did was I showed him on a cumulative flow. So this is your demand, right? This is your supply. For some period, there's nothing coming out. And then you start up again. But if you can't catch up, if you don't have that 20% protective capacity, you would have permanently your lead time and work in process. So you need that ability to catch up. So that's why like flow time and flow rate became our primary measurements for them. We had these cumulative plots at the company level where it was just we were plotting dollars of orders coming in, dollars of orders shipping out, and checking if they balanced. And then we had it at the product family level, at a product level, at a country level, at a regional level, all just cumulative flows to see, is the demand and supply balanced or not? If it's not balanced, it tells me where I have too little or too few resources. And it's something surprisingly that I don't see many companies measure at all.
It's really interesting. Well, Alan, this has been a super, super interesting conversation. I love diving into this stuff. I'd love to spend even more time talking about it. For anybody that wants to learn more or follow you or connect with you, what might they do that?
Sure. My social media handles are all just Dr. Alan Barnard. And I've got a couple of books out there that you can find on Amazon. Maybe like one of them is like my real passion is helping people make impossible decisions and achieve impossible goals, right? And what I discovered is that there's a simple hack to overcome both of those. You pick a goal and you ask, is it realistic? Yes. Okay, well, then you think you know how to do it. How can we make it impossible? By increasing the magnitude or reducing the time to achieve it, right? Until we get to the point where you say, now it's impossible. And then my simple question to you is, it's impossible unless. It turns out that our biggest limiting assumption is thinking that something is impossible. Because not only we won't try, we won't even think about trying. And that by asking ourselves the question impossible unless, it's like a disruptive question, it brings the mind back into problem-solving mode and it tries to find all the unless conditions that could make the impossible possible. So that's a simple hack that anybody can use.
So let me restate this question for you. What are some of your favorite questions to recommend to someone to consider personally or professionally?
That would definitely be at the top of my list, right? It's like, it's impossible to achieve this goal or it's impossible to make this decision unless, and let them talk to you, right? Another useful one is like, what do I really want?
Love that one.
Right?
That's so good.
It's like both for my business and not multiple things. What's the one thing I really, really want, And as a business, it's like, what can I do, or am I prepared to do that nobody else can? That really helps me find what those dream customers are. All of us make the mistake of trying to sell to too many people.
I love that question. What do I want? And I think that's probably a good tie into the AI, because in the future, the clearer you can be about what you want, the easier the AI can make it all happen. That's this whole.
Absolutely. Like I said, I think anything that's related to human beings in terms of knowledge work, AI will overcome any capacity, capability, or capital constraint that you've had.
This episode is brought to you by KPI Fire. KPI Fire is continuous improvement software. KPI Fire helps you align strategy, drive execution, and engage your people, all in one powerful software platform. So whether you're leading a team or transforming an entire organization, KPI Fire is your partner in achieving breakthrough results. You can learn more at kpifire.com. Thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. We appreciate your time and your experience. If you would like to suggest a guest, ask a question, or give us any ideas for episodes or content, please reach out to me, Keith Norris, on LinkedIn. And this concludes our episode of KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to follow us on the socials and share the podcast with friends or colleagues who are as passionate about continuous improvement as you are. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.